Hello, my name is Tony Nicholls and I am the co-founder and Chief Technology Officer of Great Ideas. This video is an introduction into a sequence of video tutorials entitled Enterprise Architecture with Examples using Microsoft .NET Blazor, Azure and Great Ideas Trellis Spark. During this introduction, we're intending to cover 5 main topics. Initially, why do you need this course? Who am I and why do I teach this course? What enterprise architecture is all about and why we need it, and finally we will discuss the structure of the course and the other videos in the series. Okay, so why do you need this course? I've been involved in developing software now for over 40 years and I am still learning new techniques, new technologies, new architectural patterns. So the idea of this course is it will benefit you in any stage of your career. What we're intending to do in this course is give you both a big picture view of what enterprise solution architecture is all about and how to build and operate large-scale business solutions, but also to drill down into the detailed implementation to show you how the enterprise solution development activity spans from concept right the way through to lines of code being implemented on particular servers. This course is going to cover essentially the scope of enterprise architecture. We're going to begin with some history of enterprise architecture as seen by myself over 40 years. We're going to be talking about modern themes in enterprise architecture. So what am I still learning? After 40 years, the scenery in enterprise architecture is still constantly evolving. As I said earlier, we're also going to be looking at some very pragmatic examples of how modern architecture is actually executed in terms of real solutions as to deployed on real hardware. And we're going to be drilling down into code examples in various technologies. So we'll be looking at some C#, we'll be looking at some T-SQL, and we'll actually see how modern enterprise architecture works in practice. So who am I and why do I teach this course? As I said, I am Tony Nicholls, the founder of Great Ideas and the lead architect for our flagship product, Trellis Spark. I've been coding over 40 years now and an IT professional for nearly 40 years. My career to date has spanned many industries. So I started looking at military applications. I've done a bunch of work in banking, financial applications, healthcare applications. So I've worked across many industry sectors and I've worked with many different sized organizations over that course of that 40-year period. So everything from small startups right the way through to large banks. Over the course of my 40-year personal journey in enterprise architecture, I've worked on hundreds of projects and worked with thousands of fellow IT professionals. So the view of enterprise architecture that you're going to hear from me over the course is a reflection of experience of thousands of different people. So IT is not about one person working on their own. It's about a person working within the context of a team. And those ideas have to be shared with a team. We have to get consensus on what we're doing, why we're doing, and get validation that the idea is actually going to be successful. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you over the course is going to be a result of working with all of these different organizations on all of these projects with all of these fellow professionals. It's not just what Tony Nicholls thinks of things, it's what the net result of learning across all of these projects with all of these people has thrown up as valid, pragmatic solutions to real business problems. Over the course of the 40 years, I've worked on all aspects. So I started initially, as many of you will have done, as a coder, developing programs, developing functions, developing classes and objects, and then into subsystem design and finally system design. I then went and did a whole bunch of work on testing and validation for military systems and safety critical flight avionics systems. So I've seen both the development experience from writing code and then actually testing and validating that code is going to work in scenarios where lives are at risk. Later in my career, I moved into looking at some of the governance and Devops around how to actually build and operate systems over time. And I've also worked as a consultant working with the highest levels of organization executives, figuring out what the business rules and the enterprise needs are, and how does that translate down into the solutions and applications and architectures we need to implement. So over the course of the lectures, we're going to be looking at different examples of enterprise architecture across a very broad reach of topics in IT. The overall objective of me teaching you this course is to help you understand a broader context of what it means to be an IT professional. So we're not going to look narrowly at how you write code or how you build a system or how you deploy that system in a particular cloud environment. We're going to be taking a very holistic view of what enterprise architecture is, and we're going to be looking at very detailed implementations of that enterprise architecture so that you can see how the lessons and patterns that we've learned as architects and senior developers are then explored and implemented in lines of code and data being stored on servers. And the end goal of this is to help you become a much more experienced and therefore valuable IT professional. So let's start with the fundamental question of what is enterprise architecture as covered within the scope of this course. So over time, I have built enterprise architectures from scratch. I've participated in enterprise architectures as they were laid out in large-scale organizations. And the framework that we're going to use for this course is essentially a summary of some of the best practices from some of the industry-leading methodologies in this space. So we're going to be talking about Togaf, ITIL, ITSM. We're going to be looking at modern Devops. We'll be looking at the Agile project management and a whole bunch of architectural patterns. And we want to give you a warning. Out of the box, if all you do is pick up the Togaf definition and then use that to define an architectural framework for your organization, that can be very ivory tower and very impractical, especially for small and medium scale organizations. Now, if you're a huge enterprise, then maybe you're going to derive some benefit from implementing a very formal enterprise architectural model, but most organizations will be able to obtain the majority of the benefits of taking a formalized enterprise architectural approach in a very pragmatic way. And that's what we're going to be covering in this course. We're going to be looking at these standards as they exist, and we're going to be looking from a very pragmatic point of view, what's actually important about these standards, why are they important, and how can we then use those to develop a very pragmatic enterprise architecture that meets the needs of my specific business. So let's start with Togaf. So essentially this was developed by the Open Group back in 1995, and it's an architectural development model. So what Togaf were trying to do was figure out how do you define an enterprise architecture from first principles, what needs to be covered in the scope of the enterprise architecture, and then how do you apply it to your organization. So this architectural development model that's been produced by Togaf is widely used amongst the Fortune 500 companies. And essentially it provides a framework for developing an enterprise architecture. So with the Togaf model, they start at the top here with a vision. The vision is then expanded into business architecture. So how does the business work and operate? What do the operations look like? What are the opportunities for doing things better? Then in bubble C, we're talking about information systems architecture. Now, I am breaking this down in this course into two separate subsections, one relating to data, so how data is actually stored, how is it moved, how do we do workflow on it, and applications, which I'm defining as workflow against data. In bubble D, we're talking about the technology architecture. So within this context, technology refers to servers, services, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's on premise, whether it's a device, a network, storage, etc. So when we talk about technical architecture, we're talking about infrastructure in one way, shape, or form that's used to deploy the information systems being used. Most of the rest of the bubbles, E, F, G, H, all relate to governance. So how do you actually go through the process of deciding what is important, prioritizing it, assigning resources to it, and making sure that it is implemented effectively? So Togaf is a great framework for actually figuring out how to go from a blank sheet of paper to a full enterprise architecture that's suitable for the needs of your organization. And again, the caveat here is it can be very ivory tower. There are a lot of steps in the Togaf framework that most organizations won't really need to perform to actually get the best out of producing an enterprise architecture, especially in the context of a small or medium-sized enterprise. So a big move in enterprise architecture in the 2000s, 2010s has been a move towards what we describe as service-oriented architecture. So service-oriented architecture, or SOA, SOA, has been around for about 15, 20 years now. The ITIL framework, so the Information Technology Information Library, was initially developed by the UK government to try and standardize the process of building software back in the 1980s. And probably the most useful iteration of this, version 3, arrived in 2007. And the ownership of this standard went to Axelos in 2013. And they provide a link here that gives you a fully downloadable, readable version of the ITIL v3 framework. A new framework has become available, the ITIL v4 framework, but personally, from a practical experience, I found the ITIL v3 was very well documented and contained a bunch of useful standards for dealing with the specification, design, implementation, and operation of service-based infrastructure. So we're going to be discussing primarily V3 during the course, but essentially you should be aware that there is a version 4. I think it's more related to training than it is to the actual service standards, but you can get a really good introduction to what ITIL is and service management looking at the ITIL V3 open books. A related standard that you might come across is ITSM, so IT Service Management. ITSM has grown out of the whole SOA frameworks movement in the last 10-15 years. And it's mostly about the operation of services. So you note inside the service wheel here, we're not so much talking about the service strategy and the design of services, the implementation of services. Most of the outer wheel here is related to the actual operation of services. So, essentially the incident management, problem and change management, how we actually put it all together in projects. So essentially what we're looking at with ITSM is this is not a standard per se. It's a movement towards trying to, come up with a set of frameworks, that deal with the operation of services. And what we find with ITSM is that it is very vendor specific. So each vendor has their own interpretation of what ITSM means, has a set of processes and tooling that supports their interpretation. And although they broadly fall into the same scope, there are minor differences between the different vendors. And it seems to be mostly about the tooling as opposed to trying to produce a definitive standard about how problem management or change management works. And if you're looking for the standard, then go back to the ITIL v3. Okay, so if you want a standard for change management, that is actually covered in ITIL v3. An emerging trend over the past 5 to 10 years has been the movement towards DevOps. So one of the issues that we've had in developing solutions is that we have, on the one hand, a development team that's largely focused on the early part of the life cycle of an application, i.e. the specification, design and build of that application, and then the dev team puts it into operations, so it goes into production, and then it's handed over to an operations team, the ops team, that's responsible for running it for the next couple of decades. And in personal practice, I've seen applications that have been running for 40 plus years. So you look at the development cycle, you're looking at maybe a year, 2 years to build a decent sized application, and then the operational lifetime of that cycle could be measured in decades. And what tended to happen was that the development team were focused on the objectives of development, and they just built it, and then they went to the operations team and said, hey, we've built this great new system, now let's deploy it. And the operations team are a bit flat-footed going, what? You've got this? What service do you need? How are you going to, So the discussion, was more of a handover from development to operations. And so what's happening now is that the development and operations are being integrated into a single team so that the entire life cycle of the application is considered from scratch. So as soon as the development team start thinking about what this application is going to do and how it's going to be done, the ops team are there supporting them, thinking, well, how are we going to deploy it? How are we going to operate it? And given our experience in operating similar systems for the last decade, what would we ask the dev team to do differently in terms of building this new system? So the idea is that the deeper integration of development and operations leads to better systems that can be smoothly operated over the life cycle of the applications. One thing that's increasingly becoming a focus of DevOps is the idea of DevSecOps. So this is the idea that as well as integrating the development and operations teams, we also need to be integrating the security teams into this discussion. So one of the great things of GDPR, when you look at that in detail, is that the idea is we want security by design. We want people thinking about how do we secure our information and how do we actually secure access to that information as a fundamental prerequisite of both the development of the application and also the deployment of that application. So, the idea of baking security into the development and operation design process so that it is there as an implicit function of the new applications. Again, when we're looking at DevOps, every vendor has their own variation of the same basic processes. It's very dependent upon the tooling that the vendor has decided to implement. Just as an example, as we go through the courses, we're going to be looking at how Great Ideas does development operations, and we should note that Great Ideas is very much a Microsoft-focused and centric organization, and that the Great Ideas team makes extensive use of the Microsoft Azure platform and the Microsoft Azure DevOps tooling. And we'll be doing a full video on how Great Ideas uses Microsoft Azure DevOps to implement our own solutions. Another topic that we will be covering in detail during the courses is around governance, and specifically around Agile project management methodologies. So the Agile Manifesto was first documented back in 2001 and has been an emerging trend over the first 10 years of 2000 to the point where at the moment I don't think you could actually initiate a project that wasn't agile. I mean, whenever you talk to a vendor, whenever you talk to a project team and how they're going to manage their projects, one of the key approaches is saying, well, this is going to be an agile project. So although this is relatively recent in something that's happened in the last 10, 15 years, it has essentially become ubiquitous in the IT industry. So we're going to be looking in detail at how the agile approach impacts the development of IT systems and architecture and why the two need to feed off each other. Again, this is not a standard. There isn't one place that you can go to and say, tell me about agile project management, and everybody would be talking about the same thing. It's very vendor specific in both tooling and process. So in some organizations, they'll use this idea here that we've got traverse sprint and cycles. Other organizations, they'll have releases and iterations. They'll have epics and user, and there's a ton of variations. But essentially, the process is very much similar, is that there is a backlog of requirements that need to be implemented. That backlog gets put into a planning phase where there is a team of developers that will be working with a full Devops, so people who are good at the business side, who are doing the design implementation, who are looking at the testing and QA, and also the operational deployment of the system. So that team as a whole, a cross-functional team, would be looking at a set of things that needed to be built, and that build process would be decomposed into a set of sprints and cycles, or releases and iterations. So there is a large cycle here where we're doing the detailed planning, and then there is a small cycle that's essentially working through on a day-to-day basis with the team, where the team are actually implementing things. And then the whole process goes through a feedback cycle where we're dropping more stuff on the backlog. One of the key differences between this agile project management methodology and the traditional waterfall methodologies that were adopted before this is that we've moved from looking at the management of individual projects into almost a logistical management of IT resources. So this is a big cultural shift that's happened over the last 10 years in terms of how we actually manage the development of large-scale applications. And hopefully this gives us a better chance of successfully delivering our IT applications that actually meet the business needs. And again, as we go through the course, we're going to be talking about some of the issues that we had with waterfall development methodologies and why they were failing, and how that is addressed by the agile project management methodologies. But that's not to say that just because you're doing something in agile means you're going to actually end up with a successful project. There are still pitfalls in the agile process that we also need to address as we go through the topic of enterprise architecture. So let's briefly talk about why we need enterprise architecture. So first and foremost, what enterprise architecture is doing is providing a single set of standards that we're going to use across all of our development team to provide very clear principles and guidelines over what systems we're going to buy, what systems we're going to build, why we're going to make specific decisions to build or buy, why we're going to choose to buy specific technologies, or if we're going to build, which technologies are we going to use. So one of the issues that I've come across over many years working in the industry is that you get frequently an organization that has bought many different applications from many different vendors, and they've built different applications. And as those teams have built the application, they've finished the end of the project, they've gone on to do something else, or there was a new flavor of technology available, or they just left the organization. So what you end up with is a bunch of applications across a wide span of technologies, some of which no longer have any viable technical support. So one of the things that we're going to talk about as we go through enterprise architecture is how do we arrive at a minimum set of technologies, languages, libraries, and services supported by the organization that meets the needs of the organization, that is effectively and efficiently supported by the IT resources available within the organization. So this is a key factor of what successful enterprise architecture is going to give the business as a value add. The other thing that we're going to be talking about from an enterprise architecture is the use and reuse of software. So ideally, we don't want to be rewriting 5 different versions of a customer management application or 10 different ways to send marketing emails. We want to try and get to a point where we build a system once, that system then provides a generic service that then is available to the organization and all of its organizational units as a whole. It shouldn't be the case that we have to continuously rebuild applications, components, and services depending on the business unit, or different flavors of, well, I have a customer here that's a corporate and a different customer over here that's a person. So we're going to be talking about how do we develop software to enable reuse, to enable us to clear some of the clutter away from our existing architectural hairballs of applications and integrations. The other thing around building an enterprise architecture is we want to make sure that the quality of the services that we're providing is increased. So we don't want to be constantly facing issues and bugs and problems with systems not being available because this service failed, so these applications are down, and therefore we need to do these manual workarounds. So what we're looking at for enterprise architecture is how do we build code better? And how do we make sure that once we've built that code and deployed that code within our operations, that we don't have single points of failure, that we have essentially high availability systems that are always there, that are always working, and that are meeting the demand from a performance perspective to make sure that users aren't seeing poor performance. And then tied into all of the above, what an enterprise architecture ultimately enables us to do from both an IT perspective and a business perspective is to reduce the training costs. So if I have an IT team of 30 people managing 80 different applications on 160 different technologies, which we have seen, you get to a point where some of those technologies and some of those applications don't have technical team members that can support them. And I might have, 6 developers working on a VB6 application, but I really need, some extra help over here on this Java application. But my VB developers who aren't doing as much can't be redeployed because I'd have to retrain them all. So the idea of the enterprise architecture is by coming up with the minimum set of core technologies, it should be possible to end up with a set of applications that I can take developers off one project who are developing in, let's say, C# and move them to another project which is also using C#, or moving them to a database. And if the database we've standardized on is SQL Server and they're using T-SQL, that's great. But if I need to move those people onto Oracle, then I've got training to do, right? It makes the workforce less flexible. So the idea from an IT perspective with enterprise architecture is by coming up with a set of standards, coming up with these guidelines, coming up with this minimum technology set, we improve the flexibility of our workforce and we improve the quality of the solutions that we're producing, and at the same time reducing the cost of training that workforce. Now, another aspect and way of looking at this is that not only does enterprise architecture reduce the training costs and the flexibility of the IT workforce, is that if we apply those same rules when we're looking at business application architecture, we can also come to a point where we have common standards around how our applications work, how we are authenticating users, how we're integrating data across applications, how we're trying to get a similar user experience across applications that mean that from a business operations perspective, the people who are using those applications have a more flexible application framework and are doing less swivelware, where to complete a task, instead of having to log in with 6 different user IDs across 6 different applications and re-enter the same data 4 times to complete a task, that what we're looking for is the ability for the user to sign in once, to enter that information once, for that information to be integrated across all of the applications that need to have access to it so that the task can be automated instead of requiring manual workflows. So again, a key thing of enterprise architecture is this isn't just about what's happening inside the IT team. This has much broader implications, and we're looking at streamlining the actual operations of the business users and the people who are actually doing the operational day-to-day tasks. So let's talk a little bit about the structure of the course. So we're breaking it down into a set of separate sections. So anything with a 0-1 is essentially introductory background material. We're taking the Togaf approach in terms of developing the architecture. So as I've already said, we're looking at business, data, application, and technical. So anything that's a 0-2 tutorial, we'll be talking about business architecture, which is essentially understanding how the business operates and what the requirements for the IT solutions are. Anything that's tagged 0-3, we're talking about data architecture. So this is understanding the information that will be stored and operated on by the business. All of the videos in the 0-4 series will be talking about application architecture. So this is the implementation of workflow or activity within the organization. So how do we code better? How do we code less? So all of the videos on technical architecture will be prefixed with a 0-5. So technical architecture is going to cover how do we deploy the information systems, so the data and the applications within the organization. So this will cover virtual and physical infrastructure. It will cover things like networks. It will cover storage. It will cover physical servers, virtual servers. It will cover platform as a service solutions. It will cover software as a service solution. So everything related to the deployment of information systems will be covered in the 0-5 sequence of tutorials. And then finally, the 0-6 sequence will be talking about governance. So this will be the operations of how do we actually go about building, deploying, and maintaining information systems over time. So all of the management, all of the DevOps will essentially be covered in the 0-6 sequence of tutorials. And in general, each of the videos in the series are essentially going to be looking at what are the essential principles of architecture and how do they add value? Why do they add value? So if we're making a statement about something to do with high availability, why do we need high availability? What are the fundamental reasons and value does availability add to the organization? What are the trade-offs between highly available systems with 99.9999% availability or 99.9% availability? Why do we draw the line? Where do we draw the line? What are the factors that will influence availability, and how do we get the best compromise for your organization? So what we're going to be looking at then is given we've made a distinction on, say, availability, what's the most pragmatic approach for achieving that level of availability within your application? How many servers do you need to deploy? How do you need to deploy them? So essentially what we're going to be looking at for each of the different principles in architecture is how do we get the most value out of each of those architectural principles with the minimum effort, risk, and cost associated with their implementation. To illustrate all of these principles and how to maximize value and minimize costs, we're going to be looking at how the Trellis Spark framework within Great Ideas implements these different architectural principles. So we're going to be looking primarily within the course at a Microsoft stack. We're going to be looking at Microsoft Cloud Services. We're going to be looking at Microsoft servers. We're going to be looking at a SQL Server. We're going to be looking at building applications using the latest Microsoft .NET Core technology. So we're going to be looking at WASM, Blazor web applications. We're going to be looking at MAUI cross-platform applications. We're going to be looking at putting workflow into T-SQL into SQL databases. We're going to be looking at Windows services. So we're going to be looking at a whole bunch of examples using Microsoft technologies, but bearing in mind that all of these fundamental principles can be implemented in any language or any technology. So although our examples are going to be taken from our own organization, most of what we're going to be describing could equally well be implemented on Azure Web Services, on the Google Cloud Platform. It could be implemented in different languages with different IDEs and different processes. So the architectural principles are the same. The implementation details in many respects will be the same. But some of the actual detailed code examples, we're going to be looking at one implementation focused primarily on Microsoft products, but they are equally applicable to other languages and technologies. So finally, I'd like to welcome you to the Enterprise Architecture course and hope that you gain some value, some insight, some new ideas, and some different ways of thinking about what enterprise architecture is and how it relates to your own enterprise.
To learn more about Great Ideas products and solutions, visit greatideas.com. That's Great Ideas with a Z.com. Thanks.